Good evening. I'd like to welcome you all to the College Roundtable on Democracy in Crisis, Lessons from Ancient Athens. I'm James Sparrow. I'm a member of the history faculty. I'm a modern US historian of politics with a special focus on war and society. I'm also the person in the college who's responsible for the social sciences core curriculum. Tonight, we're going to be conducting another of our quarterly college roundtables. Each quarter, we feature a deep dive exchange on topics that may enliven our shared intellectual life in the core. Last fall, we invited Jill Frank, a political theorist at Cornell, to give a lively talk on the place of lies in Plato's Republic. It was a very helpful way to dig into the question of fake news and the role of truth versus falsity in politics while keeping it anchored in Plato's Republic and the readings of the Sochcore. Today's discussion is also timely, with Election Day just on the other side of the weekend. To help us think about democracy in crisis from the perspective of the ancients, we have three political theorists who should be familiar to many of you, all three teaching classics of social and political thought. Dimi Kasimis is a member of the political science faculty. She's the author of The Perpetual Immigrant and the Limits of Athenian Democracy, which came out with Cambridge University Press in 2018. In addition to this work on the basis of belonging in classical Athens, she's published essays on secrecy and its implications for democratic theory. She's also done some work on rumors that I think might be relevant to our discussion today. Our next panelist is Matt Landauer. He is also a member of the political science faculty. He's the author of Dangerous Counsel, Accountability and Advice in Ancient Greece. That came out with the University of Chicago Press in 2019. Like Professor Kasimis, he's also an expert on classical democracy. He's published a number of essays on the public sphere in ancient Athens, including an article on the history of political thought on parousia, or the tradition of frank speech in confronting the tyrannical abuse of power. Today, we might talk about speaking truth to power. And that also is quite relevant to our conversation today. Our third panelist is John McCormick. Professor McCormick is yet another member of the political science faculty on this panel. He's the author of several books, including Reading Machiavelli, which came out with Princeton University Press in 2018, and Machiavellian Democracy, Cambridge University Press, 2011. He's written extensively about what we might call the dark side of democracy in modern thought. Well, so I've got to open by observing that I'm a modern historian surrounded by a bunch of theorists who work on much earlier periods of time. So my first instinct is to gain a little historical perspective. And what I'd like to do is to open up the conversation with a question. And then from that will flow a roundtable discussion among the four of us. And during that discussion, I would like to invite the audience to send their questions to us through the chat. And we'll be monitoring those as they come in. And we'll try to incorporate them into our discussion. But if that's not possible, if there are too many questions, we'll take the questions at the end of the conversation, somewhere around the hour, somewhere around 7:30 Chicago time. So please, as we begin this conversation, queue up your questions, and we'll try to get to them. So the question I'd like to start with has to do with how we're blinded by the emergencies of the present moment and by contemporary understandings of how democracy is supposed to work. It's exceedingly difficult to think clearly in an emergency. Now, last year, we've confronted a cascading sequence of emergencies: wildfires, pandemic, economic precariousness, police brutality and civil unrest, political violence and contestation around the election. These developments have exerted a baneful influence on our ability to grasp precisely how and why our democracy is imperiled. our inability to take stock of these rolling disasters and of the larger democratic failures they represent is further amplified by our national version, by what one might call the smugness of American present-mindedness, which is our national version of the modern condescension of the living toward the dead, which historians constantly confront in their work. So today, there's a near universal agreement across the political spectrum that democracy is in severe crisis. And undergirding this agreement is the assumption that ordinarily, democracy is characterized by stability and consensus. This, I would argue, is a legacy of the Cold War, in which the United States relied on democratization as the banner under which the extension of its power around the world was justified in the context of geopolitical competition with the Soviet Union and economic ambitions to develop the third world as it decolonized. Earlier political thinkers, however, including our founders, did not make that assumption. So what I was hoping we could do at the beginning of the conversation is just step back a bit from the press of assumptions and preoccupations in this fraught moment we're in, and discuss how taking the long perspective on democracy, actually, the longest possible perspective, going back to its origins in ancient Greece, to give us fresh insight into the special strengths and vulnerabilities of democracy. Noise and confusion have played such a big role in disrupting our democracy. We're in great need of some perspective, I think, and who better than the ancients to provide it. So with that, I'll turn the conversation over to our panelists and ask you to take up the conversation from there.
Great. So I'll just get us started. Those were some wonderful observations and provocations. And I think that the first thing to say is that for the ancient Greeks, for the Athenians in particular, regimes were fragile. They were not fixed. Political change was something that Plato and Aristotle write about change at the moment that it leads to, or what can go from sort of, there's a sort of political flux, but when does it become collapse, and what tips that balance? And so when we think about what the critics of democracy were concerned with, it was first and foremost the kind of the balance that existed between the poor and the rich in democracy. And so to take a step back and try to understand, what could cause a crisis in democracy, we need to talk a little bit about what a democracy meant for the Greeks. Aristotle here is probably the one to turn to, because he really thought that the most important sort of angle or lens onto democratic politics was this conflict between the rich and the poor. And democracy, if you break it down etymologically, the two Greek words are demos and kratos. So it's really people power. It's the strength of the people. And who are the people? Well, in a democracy, Aristotle thought there are always the poor. So it is ruled by the poor over the rich, which means that there's a kind of relation of domination there that is also fragile. And that equality, or that relation of between the rich and the poor, which always sort of was potentially destabilizing or destabilized and dependent on what else was going on in the Greek world. So I wanted to just sort of start there because what we see with conflict in classical Athens, which is what we're talking about, is, in order to kind of name it, the Greeks had a term which the term was stasis, and that came from the Greek verb histemi, which could mean a kind of taking a stand. So it doesn't necessarily mean civil war, although it could become a kind of civil war, but importantly, it meant two sides, maybe factions, people who occupy positions that somehow cannot reach an agreement. So even though the Greeks thought that conflict was this condition of politics, there's disagreement, right? When we talk about stasis, we're talking about something else, a kind of almost freezing in an agitated state of frozenness. So there's kind of motion and rest at the same time, which I think would, should resonate a lot for us today, that could tip over into violence. It could tip over into regime collapse. But in that state, people are really vulnerable to suspicion. And, here I just want to sort of flag that the first thinker to really try to theorize stasis and think about the different symptoms and who equated it with disease, with epidemic, was Thucydides. And the things that he mentioned, which I think we'll kind of keep circling back to, were things like lawlessness, a kind of despondence, hopelessness, semantic instability, where words sort of don't change their meaning necessarily, but they take on different value. So for instance, reckless daring becomes a sign of kind of party loyalty. So you risk things, you do dangerous things that are still dangerous, but they carry a different meaning in society. And that kind of internal division, which also kind of, it spreads, it becomes a kind of affliction. And that's why he thought that it was good to think about it in terms of a disease.
Dimi?
So yeah.
Can I just ask you to elaborate on one point of what you just brought up?
Yeah.
You talked about factionalism as well, but the main opposition you've described is the poor versus the rich. Mm-hmm. Presumably there were factions among the poor, and some of them were sponsored by or secretly organized by the rich. So how was the sort of the balance between the people, the many and the few, distinguished from sort of factional scheming and maneuvering and sort of pseudo democracy, or the sort of attempts to capture the people for the purposes that are anti-democratic? But maybe I'm also getting ahead of the conversation.
No, I mean, I think that's also a question I could punt to Matt, because I think it's a question really about how people can be persuaded by demagogues to sort of act actually against their own interest. So I still would stand by the thought that, or the point that the major lines of division are between the rich and the poor, but there are these figures who sort of traverse that boundary and are, the ones who they could be from among the people and not necessarily among the wealthiest, populations of Athenian democracy, but nevertheless be working to mobilize the demos to either be sort of more to be friendlier to oligarchy, or I haven't mentioned the word oligarchy, but that's really the regime that's always kind of like right there as an option. And it was an option 411 and 403 are two times when oligarchs successfully conspired or used force to overtake Athenian democracy. So Matt, maybe you want to say a little bit more about how people were able to be captured by these forces.
And Matt, when you answer, I wonder if you would mind, or you too, Dimi, answering or relating it to the current moment. For example, I can't help but wonder what would Athenian Democrats make of dark money? Does that look like what the oligarch maneuver to take over the polis looked like? Is it just it's just a bad anachronism to think of those as being essentially very similar kinds of things? But I don't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, I mean, I'll pick up on a few of the things Dimi was saying, and I'll get to the Jim, your question about sort of how factionalism can be thought of other than the main cleavage between rich and poor. But I think Dimi's exactly right that is really the core cleavage. And for Aristotle, I mean, you have to think, right, unlike our democracy, or at least our polity, if we want to withhold judgment of what kind of regime it really is. But unlike our polity, Athens is not really a pluralistic society by and large, right? So everyone is from the same town. almost everyone. And Dimi, you might want to bring in stuff about immigrants too, but most of the citizens are people who are from Athens. And so when Aristotle is like thinking about the sociology of the city or the anatomy of the city, he's trying to think about what are the cleavages that are relevant in a society where people share religion, they share an ethnic background, they share local identity. And the one cleavage that he thinks, and he looks around the Greek world and he sees there is a cleavage that is real, and that's the rich and the poor. And so, and then just I'll say a little bit too, I think, which was I think implicit in some of the stuff Dimi was saying, but I'll bring it out a bit more too, because I think to understand what democracy was, we also have to ask why democracy was important, right? And so why did ordinary citizens care in the ancient world, in ancient Greece, whether they lived in a democracy or in another kind of regime? And I think my understanding, my reading of 5th and 4th century Greek history is that citizens came to the judgment that only in a democracy, that is only in a city, as Dimi said, where ordinary citizens understood as the poor majority of the citizens wielded real political power, only in such a regime would their interests be promoted and would they have a chance of being treated like equal sharers in the constitution. So for Aristotle, the language of understanding how political membership is often thought of as sharing in the constitution. And democracy is the regime where ordinary people have a real share, a real stake in the regime. And so the main divide is over whether people who don't have land, they're not well educated, they're not rich, they're not from a fancy old family that traces their lineage back to some dead hero. They're just ordinary people, farmers, craftsmen, wage laborers, whether they really count. And that was the big cleavage in ancient Greece, whether people like that counted politically. And so, the reason why, so to get to the point about other kinds of cleavages, right? So in Athens, there weren't factions like political parties. This is a debate that's gone back and forth in like the historiography of ancient Greece. Were there political parties in ancient Greek democracies? But it seems likely the answer is no. And political disputes were organized around speakers. So people would get up and speak in the assembly and try to persuade their audience of what they should do. And then they sometimes found it helpful to make populist appeals and demagogic appeals, and we can continue talking about that too. But they did organize by and large into kind of ideological factions that tried to mobilize resources in favor of their coalition at the expense of others. So that wasn't really how political conflict was organized.
So I guess the question I have is this is a different society, right? They don't have a state in the sense that we mean the state. The basis of wealth and the economy is very different. And yet it seems like there are some commonalities that we can relate to, not just some abstract concept of inequality. So how did the few wield power in the context of the functioning phase of Athenian democracy? They must have had to have tread lightly or carefully.
Yeah, Dimi, do you want to come in on this?
Yeah,
Yes,
you can go ahead. Yeah.
I think the way that the wealthy exercised power was through influence, right? So especially if you were a good speaker, you could wield power that way. And then they also wielded power because the Athenians needed their money and were persuaded not to expropriate them. And so they paid taxes and they bought warships and things like that. And in return, they probably got a good say in what happened with those ships. But basically, right. So I think the way the Athenians saw the problem of class conflict was you solve it by rigorously surveilling and controlling your political officials, and you have strict accountability institutions that make sure that what they do is in line with your interests and your wishes. And you pay the poor to participate so that the poor are able to exercise power on a regular basis. And that was what they were trying to achieve.
It might be also useful to think about a historical example along those lines, right? So if you think about, during what we're referring to as the period during the Peloponnesian War, which especially for the second half, so that was around between 431 and 404. By 415, for sure, things were not going very well for the Athenians in the war with Sparta. And it is around this time that people become, I guess you could say, particularly susceptible to persuasive arguments, either against democracy, or you could say arguments about oligarchs kind of waiting in the wings, and they were waiting in the wings to overtake democracy. So it might be interesting to think about what is kind of going on the ground. How did that actually, work? And I think, for people like Plato who are writing, several decades later, looking back, one way to understand what happened, or at least in Thucydides' accounting, I think, is that there are these specific, ambitious individuals who were able somehow to, maybe this is sort of what you mean, Matt. I don't know if you use the word demagogues or I attributed it to you, but these demagogues who were capable of persuading people to back oligarchic regimes, like in 412, 411. So that's an interesting case because, to go back, Jim, to your point about sort of what is common between the two. So there are very different mechanisms, very different institutions. We're not talking about an indirect democracy, we're talking about direct democracy. Nevertheless, there's some sort of social forces and say even like political emotions that become really, I think, useful, and they seem resonant when we compare between the two. There's resentment. There's, the rich feeling like the poor are becoming actually more empowered because they're becoming more important to the war effort. And so there's a kind of erosion of at least, I don't know if there's an erosion of clear socioeconomic distinctions, but the sorts of privileges that might go along with being among the elite in Athens, and the fear that whatever balance was existing might be lost. Matthew, I don't know if you want to add anything about what it might have sort of been like on the ground, like how it might have, what would have made people sort of or made democracy vulnerable to capture by oligarchs. Yeah.
So, and I think it's actually like a really interesting question. What does it take to make a citizenry who at one point in time are committed to democratic values and to democratic procedures to lose that commitment? Mm-hmm. And to turn, to basically look at democracy as a kind of failed experiment and look for something different. And so, in my mind, on my reading of Thucydides and Aristotle and Xenophon and other people who have written about the oligarchic, so a little historical background. Athens is a democracy for most of the 5th century BC. And as Dimi's already said, there are 2 instances where the democracy is overthrown towards the end of the 5th century, in 411 and 404, 403. And these kind of brief oligarchic regimes, they don't last very long, and democracy is ultimately restored after each of them. And if you look at the sources, I think there's not really agreement in our literary sources over whether the people were ultimately like persuaded to give up on democracy. So that is like, finally, they were just like, you know what, democracy is just not working for us. Let's try something different. Or whether they were sort of like semi-persuaded, semi-compelled. Dima, do you want to come in on this?
Yeah, because I think that's really important, right? When we think from a contemporary standpoint about democratic erosion, the reason that that's become such an important term is that we're trying to capture, as political scientists or people in the media or public discourse, something that is not like an actual collapse, but that seemed to happen almost imperceptibly, right? So Matt, when you say, were people really kind of actually opposed to democracy? No, probably not, but they looked the other way. Or so the question is how regimes can sort of subtly shift, become hybrid regimes. Aristotle's really interested in this. And also to your point, he's interested in how stasis can emerge from very small things, because whatever is on the ground is already sort of, there's people are kind of they're feeling resentment, they might be feeling indifference. They also start to mistrust each other, so they think other people are plotting. Right? And they don't sort of rely on the same sorts of familial ties or social ties that they used to. I think that that contributes to this environment in which, somebody can actually be quite convincing, but I don't know if it's such as like this willful assent to like oligarchy. It's not necessarily that at all. It's kind of just like opting out or thinking that things aren't necessarily changing in a kind of consequential way, I guess.
Yeah, and I think what I think Dimi's point brings home is why these moments of crisis are so fraught. Because I think it takes like so what happens in Athens is in like 411 there's a final assembly meeting where they basically abolish the democracy. Some guy gets up before all the people who have political rights and says, I want you to take one more vote. I want you to vote that you won't take any more votes. And they vote on it. Now, whether they vote on it, there's like, the Spartans are invading, the oligarchs are killing all their leaders, people are dying on the streets. Like Dimi's saying, there's rampant conspiracy theories, there's total mistrust of each other. There's frustration and being sick of it all. And but they're sort of manipulated or forced, or they're too sick of everything not to. But they do take this final vote. And I think that that seems so impossible, and yet now we're living in a world where it no longer seems so impossible. I think you start to see what makes it seem less a crazy scenario when you live through it.
I feel a little bit like we've started in media res, and we're talking about the destabilization, but there are some elements of what made democracy possible in the first place that could be helpfully fleshed out and would connect the ancient world to our world. So one of them is this context of war that you've both mentioned. And that seems significant. I mean, my own work is about World War II, and wartime does help strengthen a sense of collective obligation and community. It certainly brightens the lines between the we and them, but it also creates a very strong sense of communal egalitarian obligation, even if it's not universal and totally equal. So if you could just speak to the context of war, which is also maybe potentially destabilizing, the fear of internal enemies, et cetera. And another external context is raised by Molly Jones in the audience, who wants to know about immigrants. And Dimi's obviously written about this, but I'd like any of the three of you to speak about maybe how migration, yes, John's holding up Dimi's book, how migration and the presence of immigrants who are treated as outsiders. It's not everybody just in one big town, but they've actually come from other lands. So how that external context also maybe have, put some boundaries or put some limiting conditions or goals. And then there are some internal things to talk about, but let's just deal with those two external contexts. War and immigration.
Okay, well, I can definitely talk about immigration. I can talk about war, but I could also divide this up. And Matt, do you want to say something about the Peloponnesian War, or should I just go? Okay. I mean, one, I'll leave more of the war stuff to use because I'm going to talk about immigration, but they're linked, you know. So in 431, which is the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War, I mean, so Athens goes from being a kind of underdog that beats the Persians, you know, the Persian War, goes from being this sort of small city state that, with the help of other Greek city states, defeats the kind of the symbol of autocracy, actually, and then in the form of Persia. And over time, builds up a kind of, what emerges out of that war is a kind of coalition or a league of these Greek city-states that are sort of working together, but over time Athens becomes a kind of hegemon. And instead of treating the other city-states in the Greek world as allies, starts to treat them as sort of subjugated peoples. And at least in Thucydides' account, there's a kind of growing tyrannical, there's a tyrannical orientation to these other Greeks that is important for thinking about how democracy inside Athens also changes. So we have this, it's not just a war, it's a kind of empire, and the war breaks out in that context with different city-states on different sides between Athens and Sparta. And so the reason that that's important is that you've got this kind of, it's basically an inter-Hellenic conflict. It's not the Greeks versus the Persians. It's sort of within one ethnos, even though these are different city-states speaking different dialects of Greek, and, you know, Athenians distinguish citizens from other Greeks. I mean, citizens had to be of Athenian descent on both sides. So this is important because it also means that in this moment, there's a ton of mobility in the Greek world after the Persian War, with people settling in Athens from places as far away as, you know, Syria or Egypt, but also really close by, Corinth. And they are kept disenfranchised generation after generation on the basis of blood, even though they're free. And those people were called metics. They're slaves in Athens. And as someone else, you know, in the Q&A mentioned, you know, Athenian citizenship it's exclusionary in the sense that, you know, women, even Athenian women who were technically citizens, did not have the privileges that we typically associate with citizenship. They were excluded from the formal institutions of democracy, the kind of public dimensions, although they participated in religious rites, which the Greeks thought were civic. Okay, so in this context, there is, I mean, the war is clearly, in some sense, beneficial to the Athenians economically, but very quickly goes south and becomes not only increasingly risky, but a kind of drain on Athens financially. And I wouldn't say that there's any reason to think that immigrants become, they're not really kind of mobilized in this, they don't make demands. There isn't that much of an interest in extending citizenship to them in this context, but they are important militarily. I mean, they are fighting on behalf of the Athenians in the Peloponnesian War. And so there is this question about, you know, what it means to be a citizen if you are acting like one. So I could say more about some of these conflicts and how they might relate, but it's not immediately apparent to me. I think along the lines that Matt was raising, the points he was raising before, I think the more important cleavages are economic, and metics they were among some of the they weren't all like this, obviously, but they in some cases, like the people in the Republic who host Plato's Republic, they could be some of the wealthiest people in Athens.
I'm struck by the similarity to the American experience, not just to be an American who projects everything from America outward, but, you know, the United States leading the Allies against fascists in World War II, mm-hmm. and then leading its own alliance against the Soviets. And also American immigration opens up in '65 as a consequence in some ways of those wars in Southeast Asia. And that's what transforms the United States, ends the period of restriction, opens up this multicultural America with people coming from parts of the world who really hadn't been in the United States before. And it's part of American empire and hegemony. And then that produces a lot of, you know, politics of ressentiment, as you were talking about, you know, this kind of pushback. Obviously, there's some important differences, but so would you say then that the presence of people from around the Athenian Empire was destabilizing, or helped expand the concept of who the many were, because medics were kind of like slaves, but kind of like members of the polity? Obviously, they were probably different positions in the populace, but.
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say that, legally, historically, there isn't this expansive notion of Athenianness or citizenship. But for the theorists who are criticizing Athens and interested in thinking about what democracy really is, I think there is most certainly a question about who really makes up the polis, who makes up this city, who makes a democracy run. And one of the things that I've always thought about Plato's Republic is that it matters that this is set in the port of Athens, in a kind of famously immigrant area, that it's in an immigrant's home. It's as if, Plato's saying to us, if you really want to rethink Athens, you want to rethink democracy, you need to think about it in its entirety. All of the people, what is membership really? So I think it's that these are matters of contestation. They're not settled for the Greeks. And looking at the empire, thinking about what sustains Athens. Athens is not just Athens. It's the metropole that's sustained by, everything else, all these other peoples. And that is, as people are really saying in the Q&A, there's this tension there. And I mean, if you think about Greek tragedy, it depicts, women all the time in these various sort of like political conundrums. Obviously Lysistrata is about, a conspiracy by women to sort of take over the political life of Athens and make peace. So even if women were not, given the vote, as someone, is saying in the Q&A, there is a rich dialogue happening among Athenian critics about really who's in and who's out. It's a live question, is what I'm trying to say, even if historically it doesn't look necessarily like that.
You have, again, more parallels in the post-war period, where at the height of American empire and hegemony, civil rights, second wave feminism, and human rights centered initially around things like, the Geneva Convention and around the rights of refugees, and working its way into theorists like Hannah Arendt and a whole set of cosmopolitan theorists by the end of the century. The cutting edge of theory ends up being driven by similar kind of displacements in the modern period. Again, not to conflate, but.
Yeah, Matt, can I just add one more thing before you jump in? I think that I probably too quickly dismissed the issue of immigration being important. Obviously, I think it's important, but I think in one regard, we need to consider its import, which is to say that because citizenship was blood-based in Athens, there is a kind of exchange happening. There's a dialogue happening among critics about whether that should be the criterion for citizenship. What kind of democracy do you get when it's invested in nativism? And I think you get an expansionist one. You get one that can go and, subjugate other peoples in the name of a certain kind of ethnic superiority. Now, I think that that's the rationale that's provided after the fact, right? But these things are important to kind of look at together, that because citizenship was understood along ethnic lines, in an imperial context, when where Athenians could go and colonize and be Athenian and give birth to Athenians, in these colonies, but these members of these colonies could not move to Athens and gain full citizenship. That's the landscape, and that's provoking a set of questions about what citizenship really means.
I'll follow up a little bit on what Dimi's saying. I sometimes am attracted to a kind of opposite counterfactual scenario, so it's a counterfactual, so we can't assess it. We don't know what would have happened. But I think if Athens had actually been slightly more successful in its empire, it could have developed a more open conception of citizenship. So because basically Athens almost takes over the entire Mediterranean world, right? So they lose when they go to Sicily. But if they had taken Sicily, that's a great base of operations to take Italy, to take North Africa, the Carthaginians, right? So they could have been Rome. And just like Rome originally had an exclusivist citizenship body, but eventually, the allies, the social war in Rome is the war between the allies who are demanding Roman citizenship. So I think a counterfactual Athenian history could have developed a more capacious conception of citizenship, but it never had the chance. And I think the nativism, as I think was implicit in what Dima was saying, is really tied in with the war effort too, because there are all these benefits that citizens get from war. So I think, and from the empire. So it's no coincidence that Athens tightens its laws about who can be a citizen with Pericles' citizenship law. So that means you have to have, is it 4 Athenian grandparents, Dimi, or just 2 Athenian parents? Yeah, so basically, a half Athenian can no longer share in the benefits of citizenship. And that's because there's real material benefits flowing into the city, plus real human beings flowing into the city from the empire. And they're the people who have some claim on these resources are like, oh, these are mine. They're not this guy who just came in from, some crummy little town that we happened to conquer, and now he's a refugee and he wants some of my resources. No way. I mean, so it's unsurprising kind of mentality. But I also wanted to pick up a little bit on what Dimi was saying about the fight over who should really count as a citizen, and what does citizenship really mean? I think, and what makes a political community? What is it that people have to share to be part of a political community together? I think that that is a really important question in Greek political thought, and it comes out of their reflection on empire and democracy and oligarchy and this whole history that we've been talking about.
So I'm going to take a little chance here when you bring up this question, which I think could have a dark side to it. Because what do people have to share? Well, thick ties can be ugly. They're not just positively normative. So I want to ask John if he wants to chime in on whether any of what we've been talking about connects to a realist conception or a Machiavellian conception of democratic power and politics.
Well, certainly that. Well, I'd prefer to hear Matt and Dimi talk all evening. That would be great. But the authors that Matt and Dimi are talking about were, as they said, pretty critical of democracy, and so I think that gives concepts like stasis and demagoguery a kind of and a pejorative notion that Machiavelli didn't have about them. So he wouldn't have described the kind of conflict that beset the rich and poor in Greek cities as stasis. He would have said it's the rich trying to extract more from the poor. It's the rich trying to dominate the poor more explicitly. He would have given it a one-sided causality rather than Aristotle's kind of, well, they're both intransigently antagonistic. So there's that element. I mean, I think the whole, Machiavelli would have laughed at the idea of democratic erosion and the euphemism that is, the kind of passivity of that. Democracies erode, popular governments erode, democratic republics collapse because the oligarchs destroy them. That's why it's not a natural occurrence like the erosion of your beach, your local beach. It's somebody is actively trying to overthrow them, and Machiavelli would say that all popular governments, whether Athenian democracy or the Roman Republic or the republics of his day in Italy and in Switzerland, are always the objects of conspiracies against them by the oligarchs. And the oligarchs are indispensable in establishing these regimes. They usually, some large portion of the wealthy decide that maybe we can do better under a republic or a democracy than under the autocracy we're living under, or maybe a democracy or a republic will arbitrate differences among us oligarchs more peacefully than we're managing ourselves, and so they buy in. But very often they're unsatisfied with the results, and whenever that dissatisfaction sets in, the first opportunity of a crisis, the oligarchs will strike to overthrow the republic. So we have, the Peloponnesian War didn't cause oligarchic conspiracies against Athens. It just gave an opportunity to hatch them. In Rome, once it was no longer possible for the Senate to postpone the social question of distributing land, once Rome had defeated Carthage and had no viable enemies, they resort to assassination and murder of Tiberius Gracchus to prevent the redistribution of wealth in Rome, and basically set in motion Rome's collapse. So I think Machiavelli helps us think about the death of democracies in a kind of structural way, that there's always, and this relates to contemporary America, right? And besides Machiavelli's Florence or Machiavelli's Rome, I'm also familiar with the Weimar Republic. And, there's an excellent recent book called The Death of Democracy, Hitler's Rise to Power and the Downfall of the Weimar Republic by Benjamin Carter Hett. And it's a terrifying book, because the story there is that the center right in Weimar, rather than coalition with the center left, decides to play a game with the far right. Let's see how much we can control the Weimar Republic ourselves by refusing to compromise with the center left, and let's use the far right to entrench our own power. And of course, that's a game that they lose. The far right takes that power from them. Machiavelli saw the Florentine aristocrats play the same game with the Medici. Let's use the Medici. Let's bring the Medici back so we can overthrow the Florentine Republic, and then we'll have an aristocratic republic. No, the Medici come back and suppress them. So I think there's just a pattern. I think that democracies are just susceptible to the oligarchs, to the wealthy who were once split over their support of democracy, kind of reaching a reconciliation about overthrowing them. And they become very well-resourced, very cynical, very aggressive force against the democracy, and will, flout every norm and, if possible, violate every law to overcome democratic institutions.
Gee, that sounds so familiar. Where have I heard that before? So it seems like, first of all, there's a tension between an instrumental understanding of democracy as a means to an end and a normative understanding of democracy as a normative order. And so we've got two anonymous questions that kind of get at this in two different directions. One asks about the short-term suspension of democracy, the use of a dictator or autocracy to get through an emergency to preserve the republic or a democracy. And the United States has had an extraordinary an imperial presidency as a consequence of that kind of logic, starting in World War II and then continuing. But then there's also the question of the sort of the opposite of that, not the suspension of it, but the return of democracy. So there's a question from Zizun Zhu, who asks, what does the resurgence of Athenian democracy from the aftermath of the Peloponnesian War suggest about the resilience of democracy, if anything? And I want to emphasize here that there's a tendency to just talk about democracy like it's an actor. I mean, it's just it's a consequence of the language that we use. And how do we think about the sort of the gaps in democracy? It also gets to the question about slaves and women, that can we even think of Athens as a democracy if most of the people are enslaved or silenced or excluded? what do we make of these suspensions and gaps and not just outright assaults, but sort of the incompleteness of even Athenian democracy at its peak?
Well, I'd just like to address that question related to the pluralism question that was raised earlier. I think the comparative set for Athens is not contemporary multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious democracies, but Sparta and other oligarchies in their own world, which make Athens look incredibly pluralistic. That makes Athens look incredibly inclusive if you don't only think about the citizenship markers, right? So Athens's critics, Plato, Xenophon, pseudo-Xenophon, they thought Athens was far too permissive in its treatment of non-citizens. Its treatment, pseudo-Xenophon complains, you can't even slap a poor person on the street because you can't tell whether it's a citizen or a slave. So they have these laws that you can't slap, a poorly dressed person in the street. That's outrageous, or Plato satirizing, even in Athens, even dogs talk back to their masters. There's so much non-hierarchy. There's such a non-observance of hierarchy, and the research on slavery is that there, just as there are enormously rich medics, there are enormously rich slaves in Athens as well. That there's a lack of regulation, and we're comparing this city to a city like Sparta, which doesn't allow foreigners. Number one, women don't, women are either even more excluded from public life because the men sleep with each other in barracks, and they kill their slave population periodically to keep them in line. So that's why. And if you add to that the fact that Athens is, as Matt and Dimi said, it did constitute a regime where the poor ruled the rich. You put all those things together, I think it's okay to call Athens a democracy.
But what do you make, and this I want to bring Dimi and Matt in on this. Even so, what do you make of this, suspensions or exceptions in a polity that is so much more democratic than the other polities? Does it have a significance? Not to say that it was false or non-existent, but what does it tell us about how it worked that it still had so many exceptions or conditions in which it could be suspended?
I'll say something briefly about that, and then I also want to talk about these questions about resilience, which I think are really, really interesting. So I think democracy, right? I think what's striking about Athenian democracy is its openness to ordinary people, as understood by the cultural norms of the time, right? And so people could imagine even more open regimes, like regimes Dimi already mentioned. In plays and in philosophy, sometimes they imagine what would it be like for women to participate in politics, but that was not within most people's cultural ken of the sense of the possible and the realistic. And so that's the same, for us today, thinking about a world state, it's probably similarly far away. And so, so I think it would be great, maybe, but it doesn't. We don't know how to get there from here. So I think, right, I think what makes it democratic is the sense that it's open to ordinary people, and then I think that's an idea that's unfolded actually, I think, over time, and it's been contested. Who should count, and how can we think about bringing new people into the fold of our political community and giving them rights of participation and the ability to have a say? And I think, right, so I think this is a particularly important moment in that history. So now I'm trying not to be teleological because I don't think it's one directional, but I do think that I'd say we've made progress on the idea of what democracy really means, and I would defend that claim. Even if there's no teleology in the history, I think conceptually and normatively we have made progress on understanding the idea.
I guess one thing that would be, almost to play devil's advocate and kind of go along with what Jim's proposing here, Athens was actually notorious for being very hard on women. And women Athenian women were more restricted than women in some other cities. They really were not supposed to be in public. And they were financially also more restricted. So they weren't, it's not clear if they were property holders in the same way that Spartan women were. Now that's interesting to me because it makes me wonder whether, one way of thinking about what the privileges of democratic citizenship are, we might want to think about how burdensome they are. There's this, clear understanding among at least the critics of Athens that to really participate, you have to have the time to do it. You have to be out of the house doing it. The kind of emphasis on the public space, the kind of transparency that's involved, and the way that like the private, domestic, feminine sphere is important to keep kind of, uncontaminated by that. And so I'm just wondering whether, there is something that we could say more about why Athenians were so invested in this distinction. It's true that it was very rare for women to be politically empowered, but there were cases of that. There were the Amazons, there were cities that were known for being a little bit more lax. But then of course, as John was saying, Sparta didn't even allow foreigners in. So, but it's interesting to think about sort of what it was about the actual practice of Athenian politics that seemed to be constituted against, how it got its definition through those particular kinds of exclusions, the sort of androcentric, nativist, membership politics. At the same time, keeping in mind that who counts as part of the demos is a live question. The membership boundaries are for any polity, always a question, always in flux.
Well, and wasn't that often raised in the question of who's the true enemy of the demos? So we were before this, we had a little brainstorming session about what the ground we'd like to cover. And one of the things that Matt raised was the problem of distinguishing between a truly democratic leader and a demagogue. So like in the 20th century, Roosevelt was hated by conservatives as a demagogue, that man who took 4 terms, who started the imperial presidency. If you're a conservative, that's a nightmare that didn't end when Roosevelt died because of the New Deal coalition. If you're center left, of course, then that's the partial success of democracy, because there were many things that were not accomplished even in the New Deal. So how do we think about where to draw that line? I mean, now we have we have bright line watch. We have this idea that we can draw lines between democracy and its opposite. But are demagogues a creature of democracy, or is it better to think of them as a pathology? I mean, in the middle of the 20th century, my own work focuses on how insistently Cold War liberals were determined to pathologize democracy. So they absolutely saw demagogues as creatures of mass democracy. So you needed to limit and constrain, have a limited state and constrain the masses so you wouldn't get too much democracy and it would turn into the terror. But this is an earlier period before anything like the Russian Revolution was dreamt of. What's the best way to think about demagogues, and how are they different from really incredibly popular majoritarian democratic figures?
So it's like, Jim, what you're asking is demagoguery really not just a kind of elite term of
well, that's one way
critique,
to put it. I mean, I definitely think that we can distinguish between demagogues and democratic leaders, but I think as a philosophical exercise, it's a challenge to explain what are the criteria for deciding that a leader is a demagogue. And you really see this in some of the worst parts of American history. I mean, if you look at sort of the darkest days of the Jim Crow South in the 1910s, 1920s, Pitchfork Ben Tillman, incredibly popular, mass support among poor whites as well as wealthier whites. Of course, this was in like a rotten borough system, so it wasn't that democratic electorally, but there were, he was incredibly popular. Huey Long, who didn't play to race, was also incredibly popular. But can you call Huey Long a democratic leader? I wouldn't. And yet he clearly drew on democratic power. So I don't know, what are some conceptual tools we can draw on to distinguish between demagoguery and democratic leadership?
Yeah, Matt, do you want to
Yeah.
field that?
I think it's actually a hard question, and I think, I'm tempted to say that there's a kind of, so I think we could start by distinguishing along the lines that Jim was pointing out for us, right? So I think people who are unhappy about democratization and who stand to lose from efforts at redistribution and paying for new social programs and things like that are going to look askance at anyone who is building a popular coalition in that direction, and are going to cast the accusation of demagoguery. And so I think we actually should take seriously the possibility that it's just, like Demi was saying, it's just elite abuse to diffuse democracy. I think we should take that as a serious possibility. But I think that if you look at the best critiques of demagoguery that you get in the ancient world, there's more to it. And I'll add a couple of features that I think might help us think about this. So one thing I think that demagogues often provide is a kind of fantasy for citizens that gives them like an aggrandized sense of their own power, channeled conveniently through the demagogue often, and also of the kind of ease with which politics can happen, right? So the thought is, right, we're going to get some big thing done, and we're going to get it done quickly and easily, and there's going to be we don't have to consider the downsides and the costs, and this is where we're going, and this is going to be great. And I think that's that kind of fantasy. I think democracies and any regime where decision makers are prone to wishful thinking, that's a problem. And then I think the other side of it too is, which I think helps to bring out the sense of unity and self-aggrandizement, is often picking on some smaller group as the target of your, so you mobilize around a goal, and then you also mobilize around an enemy. And if you do both of those, you're onto something pretty powerful.
Sometimes that smaller group can be the wealthy and the distant wealthy, and sometimes it can be the many, but the disempowered many, the poor. Does that matter if the enemies are potentially, are very powerful, or is it just about mobilizing fears of a distant power around scapegoats?
Do you mean, does it matter normatively or politically, or what?
Either way, honestly, like.
Yeah, I mean, I think that generally this form of politics often doesn't end well. I'll just leave it at that. So I think, like, John and I might disagree on this, but I think it's noteworthy that Athens, after the oligarchic coups, did not. They basically told the rich people, after the second time they tried to destroy the whole city, they said, you guys can either get the hell out of town, like go into exile, or start playing by the rules. And they managed to then make democracy a going concern again for a century. Pretty stable regime, basically until Alexander ended the game for everyone. So I think they would have, like, as Aristotle recognizes, they would have been well within the rights to just string up all the rich and go on without them, and they chose not to. And I think that the decision worked for them to not do so. And I think that's worth thinking about.
Demi or John, do you want to jump in on this?
Well, I thought the way you posed the question about who the enemy is, that's the distinction between left and right-wing populism, right? I mean, if the enemy is the wealthy few and we're going to expropriate them, that's left-wing populism, and that's normatively defensible, I think. And if the enemy are far immigrants or ethnic or religious minorities who, in being minorities, are actually quite vulnerable and not powerful at all, well, that's right-wing populism, and that's not morally defensible.
Demi?
Yeah, I was just gonna say something about demagoguery and its kind of the inherent ambiguity. Because I mean, if you break it down, you know, the Greek verb agogo, it's like to lead the demos. Now, of course, there's this question about persuasion that's implicit here. Is persuasion, which, you know, so with the beginning of democracy, you get this just like big concern about speech and about its is speech. I mean, you see this in Gorgias's encomium of Helen. When is speech like force? When is it deceit? When is it something that you're actually, you know, actively engaging with and judging? And these were questions that the Greeks posed because there's a deep mistrust or a worry about the, but also just an acknowledgement of the polyvocal meaning of facts, or of, well, maybe not facts, but definitely the words, right? And also how they could be, how in the practice of sort of relaying them, you know, you are offering an interpretation. And so who is going to do that talking to people? Or what is it, just the sort of acknowledgement of the rhetorical dimension of speech. And its persuasiveness. And sometimes that's going to look like, you know, you're being tricked, and sometimes it's going to look like you're being convinced. And that's again, that's something that they're really worried about. So I don't know if it's always, now there are demagogues who are deceiving the people, but then there are demagogues who are also sort of, I mean, in Plato's account, it's like he says something in book 6 of the Republic, he talks about how kind of being with the people, being an orator basically is learning to be with a wild animal, understanding its wants and its needs, and basically accommodating those wants and needs. You mirror back to the people what they want. You're a flatterer. You're someone who gets in their good graces. So that's, I mean, that's a form of activity, but I don't know how active or transformative it is. And yet, as Matt was saying, there's this inclination to sort of imagine politics. I don't know if this is really what you were saying, but in this kind of simplistic way, just that there's a demagogue that's leading the people. And actually, maybe that would be really great to be led to a decision very simply. But it's also a fantasy of how politics works, right? That's you could say it's even a kind of paranoid fantasy, that there is one person sort of not, in this case, not behind the scenes, kind of out in the open doing everything. So maybe it's not that paranoid, but it's definitely a simplification.
I'm tempted to go in two different directions. One is to take the bait from the recent discussion of enemies and ask if that's a little too Schmittian, if we need to think of politics grounded in agonism without considering its opposite, you know, the opposite of stasis. Demi, I can't pronounce this word. It's not eunomia, but it's...
Well, Matt, you were going to address this, that there are two possible, sorry, one is homonoia. And what was the other one that you were thinking of?
The term I found was eunomia, but I'm not a classicist, so I don't. The idea is like good government, civic action, cooperation, kind of the opposite of this more agonistic definition of politics that we've been working with. And it seems like that's got to be in there too. I mean, we kind of got to it through the discussion of trust and belonging, but Matt, I don't know if you want to chime in on that, or if we also have other questions in the queue that we could go to if you feel like we've talked that out.
I mean, so I think this is, so I think that this, you know, when I was saying like at the end of the war, right? When they're choosing whether to kick the oligarchs out or whether the oligarchs are going to come back in and be part of the new democracy. The word the word homonoia that Demi is referencing for us, which you could translate as like one, literally it's like one-mindedness, but you could translate it as concord, or you could give it a less highfalutin translation and just call it agreement, right? It's coming to an agreement. That word becomes really important. It's actually probably coined around this time, and it's part of the sort of democratic ideology into the 4th century, that the city has come back to some kind of agreement. And so I actually think that this is like this is an important question for us to be thinking about. So someone asked in the Q&A, like, what can reset democratic norms, right? So like, after a period of erosion, or a period where we're undergoing these moments in this time where we're all disoriented, and the kinds of like destabilizing and atomizing features of our politics that Dimi was talking about at the beginning of our panel are features of our political life. What could reset this? And I think, like, I don't know. I think that that's a pretty urgent question to me. I think you need something that enables people, and I think this is sort of the Platonic and Aristotelian view. You need something that enables the people in a political community to understand themselves as part of a whole. And that doesn't have to be, so Jim, you when we talked about this a little earlier, you were worried that this has to be really thick, right? So this is like the specter of thick ties that then often means if there's thick ties between some of us, there's probably some people who aren't included in the thick ties, and you just start the friend-enemy distinction all over again. But I don't think it has to be like that. I think the hope is that there can be a kind of agreement that's put in place through institutions and education probably, and some kind of civic understanding that is the basis for political stability of a kind and for a kind of political community. But whether how you reset that, I think, is the big question that we're going to have to think about if our politics isn't going to get a lot worse.
Maybe it has to do with not whether there's a friend-enemy distinction or an agonism driving politics, along with cooperation, trust, consensus, norms, whatever you want to call them. Maybe it has more to do with how the agonism is configured and how norms create boundaries for that competition to make it sustainable.
Yeah, well, I mean, so I also think, right, I think in a certain way, like this is a Schmittian point, right? So I think if you think that, democracy, if you think that the winning side in a democracy is everyone, like the people won, then you're automatically going to think that the losers aren't part of the people. And then this is very quickly going to become vicious, right? So I think we need, I think the Platonic and Aristotelian, one of their critiques of democracy is trying to reimagine politics such that it doesn't habitually involve creating winners and losers that see the other side as a threat. Now, I think that's not easy to do, and they recognize it's not easy to do. But I think the appeal of it is just to avoid these kinds of destabilizing dynamics.
Yeah, in US history, C. Van Woodward famously observed that the white upper class in the South, after Reconstruction collapse, successfully established right-wing populism by tricking poor whites into thinking that African Americans were their enemies. And that's been the basis for Herrenvolk democracy ever since. And this ties into a question that came to us from the audience about wanting a little more discussion of John's definition of right-wing populism. Asking us, don't they attribute the influx of outsiders in a polity, or in the Jim Crow South, the conditions of the African American community, to the attractiveness of cheap labor to the wealthy few that enables exploitation. So in this respect, the right wing attributes culpability both to outsiders and the few. The latter causes the appearance of the former. So this has to do with, like, who is able to define who the enemy is. So that it goes back to the friend-enemy distinction. But the response to that in ancient Greece or in the late 19th century South doesn't have to be a sort of an oppositional agonism. It could be to redefine who can work together, right? To not accept that distinction. If Southern populists had successfully formed an alliance with the Colored Farmers Alliance, for example, maybe that could have been preempted. Here, I think historical specificity makes it hard to generalize about where populism is going to go. So we have another question in here that goes in a somewhat different direction, but it picks up on some of the things Dimi was saying earlier, I think, or at least it could be brought into conversation with it. Dimi, you were talking about language. the destabilization of maybe not meanings exactly, but usage or context or interpretations of language. And Linda Zerilli, a member of our faculty in political science, has sent in a question about the current sort of obsession with truth and fake politics. And she wants to know, what are we getting wrong about the sources of the crisis? I'm thinking in particular, she writes, about the almost obsessive focus on the question of truth, the attack on truth, so-called post-truth politics. Is this focus something of a red herring when we consider what the Greeks can teach us about the sources of democratic erosion? So I just want to relate her question to this issue of semantic flux and get at this assumption, again, that we tend to have today, that we have to have a consensus on norms and meanings. The definition of what is can't be lawyered on the left, and the meaning of things like torture or democracy can't just be argued away on the right. But is this focus on both sort of empirical truth in the form of just factual reporting about things like COVID, and then sort of more like semantic honesty about the way we use language when we talk about tyranny in contemporary politics? Is that the issue, or is it just kind of epiphenomenal in a way? And what really matters is that, the 1% have arrogated all of the surplus value of the economy for the last 40 years, despite rising productivity. That's a modern present-centered way of asking you. In ancient Athens, do you think that language and debates over truth and Demi rumors were really fundamentally destabilizing, or were they more symptoms of structural destabilization?
I mentioned that sorry, what?
I hope I haven't butchered Linda's question trying to relate it to language.
No, it's a great question. I mean, at the beginning of our discussion, I mentioned that Thucydides tries to identify the symptoms of stasis, and one of the symptoms is like the semantic instability, that words don't change their meaning, but as you were saying, Jim, they're used differently. They're used simultaneously to mean contradictory things in some cases, or more like people. So I use the example at the beginning of kind of this like reckless behavior that starts to actually look brave. And people are not unaware that it's still reckless, but there's a kind of, there's a simultaneous use of both of those possibilities. But maybe more importantly, there's a kind of interest in disrupting the usual meaning. There's a kind of pleasure that's taken, according to Thucydides, in this sort of behavior. So, it's hard for me to answer Linda's question fully, but I would say that, maybe one thing we have to think about is whether the Greeks have this idea of factual truth that is so clearly distinguishable from truth. For them, I mean, if you think about Thucydides and his account, it's an accounting, it's a kind of witnessing of the events of the war, and he gives multiple perspectives within that. It's not just his first person perspective. And yet there is this increasing worry. So I think it is a bit of a red herring in the sense that there's this, like, along with this economic and political instability, there's this increased suspicion about deception, and that all language is kind of misleading, and that people are misleading each other. And, Thucydides talks really beautifully about the moment when democracy kind of falls, or right before it, when there's a lot of suspicion in the air, and there's this fear that there's actually been a conspiratorial effort to overthrow democracy. And he says that they kind of, the demos could not get to the bottom of it, that it was all hearsay, and that people had different opinions, and no one can say for sure what happened, right? So I think it is just a feature, at least in Thucydides, of this moment, but it's not necessarily the cause. And I don't think that the Greeks would say that nobody knew the truth, but there's some kind of, that there's a lack of trust, and maybe it's just not given the importance any longer. because even that kind of, he says, this prudential way of thinking and dealing with facts is no longer valued. It's about actually being almost like vigilant and sort of pig-nosed about what you think. It's no longer a democratic value, actually, I think, to weigh things the way it had been before.
Just to follow on that, I think more important than truth in these contexts, at least on Thucydides' analysis, was something like a shared orientation and understanding, right? And so what's really happened is that people's perceptions of the political world no longer converge on certain very basic understandings and kind of world pictures. And that, I think, should be very familiar to us right now. And so, the passage that Dimi's discussing in Thucydides, it's picked up, for those of you in classics of social and political thought, it's picked up by Hobbes, who you'll see next quarter is going to say things like, some people call prudence what other people call this, and some people call wisdom what other people call, mere smartness. There's this, like, for Hobbes's view is that this is just like a fact about humans as individuals, and he's a kind of skeptic about how people use language very generally, but for him it's a point about individuals. For Thucydides, it's a point about how social groups and political dynamics lead to these kind of very, very different understandings of the world. And so I think that's what's going on there. And I think, the causes of it, again, in the ancient world would have been very different than the causes of it today, right? They don't have Twitter, but the kind of disorienting and like loss of shared understandings part of it, I think, is what I get when I talk to my neighbor. I'm in Ohio right now, and my neighbor, Larry's probably not watching this. Hi, Larry. My neighbor is, probably a Trump voter. And, we talk in it takes us if we talk about politics, which we do once a month, probably, it takes us a good 10 minutes to enter each other's worlds, and I only do it because I see him all the time next door. Otherwise, he's probably the only Trump voter I talk to on a regular basis. And it really takes a while for us to see the world at all the same.
Well, John, do you want to chime in on this? Well, I think, Dimi, yeah.
Just very quickly, I want to add that while it's a symptom, the sort of the questions about truth and this use of words I was talking about before is a symptom of maybe what we would call erosion or stasis. It can also lead to regime collapse or coups, in the sense that, what Thucydides is interested in is how people end up becoming so fearful and unsure of things and unsure of the truth that they kind of they're paralyzed, actually, and they allow certain figures or groups to take control of a regime of the democracy right before their eyes. So I don't want to say that it's not then a kind of cause or factor in collapse, because I think it is.
But there's the question of whether or not the cause is because of failure of what someone like Habermas would call communicative action, or is it a failure of a kind of shared moral normative universe, or is it a lack of information? It seems like this problem raises really serious questions about the possibility of the rule of law. If you don't have, you have posses and sheriffs declaring themselves constitutional authorities throughout the country right now, because they reject the established constitutional law and the state and federal laws that have been prevailing in the United States for since throughout the 20th century. And it seems like if you don't have a stable horizon of reference, stable set of meanings, and that they don't refer to a shared social world, it's very hard to imagine how the law could operate. And it seems like the law in the ancient world was very different from the law in the modern world. Do you want to mention, is that something that has to do with how stable democracy was then? like courts, juries, that kind of thing?
Well, I mean, maybe I'll leave some of that to Matt, but I want to just say in response that, yeah, the one of the signs of this kind of erosion, what we're calling erosion or collapse, is a lawlessness that extends to a shift in convention. So nomos for the Greeks is both law and customs that are, you know, pretty naturalized. They really do, especially for Aristotle, make up a politeia. They make up a polis's way of life, and that actually the most important thing for him are those things that are not necessarily laws in the way we use laws, but the things that a society is bound together by. They are conventions, and those things, people transgress those all the time in Thucydides' account of stasis, and that is so. I forgot the beginning of your question, but I think that that's definitely, it's a huge issue. And I think for Aristotle, it's the first concern is how do you maintain those? Because then if you can, you will avoid the kind of serious political, the convulsions that we're seeing right now. Matt, do you want to say anything about juries or laws or anything?
I didn't mean to bring in the rule of law as a red herring, because it's also used as a polemical actors category to shut down democracy. But it is now suddenly of great value to liberals in a way that it wasn't 30 or 40 years ago, because it was used by ideological actors to try to hem in sort of executive action and unaccountable legislatures, and to sort of like legalize politics. But you know, it seems like it's just the way that juries worked was very different, and the whole concept of what the law was very different.
Yeah, I mean, there was the most distinctive feature in a democracy was basically the control of ordinary citizens over the interpretation and the interpretation of the law, the execution of the law, and over whether laws should be changed or not, right? So basically, the legal system was in the hands of ordinary people, and it was relatively hard, I think, to use the legal system, broadly speaking, to subvert what ordinary people thought was their interest, right? So jury nullification is the law of the land, right? If the citizens don't want to vote for something, they don't have to vote for it,
Right.
and that was a protected right.
So did they have any concept of judicial review, which was a Federalist invention to hem back the Jeffersonian Democrat?
Well, it's judicial review by the people. So there is judicial review. And so decrees in the assembly can be challenged on the grounds of their illegality or their being inexpedient. But the final decision is in the hands of a panel of ordinary citizens. You know, basically, instead of kicking it up to 9 justices in the Supreme Court, they kick it to a room, but either a building or outside, a panel of 500 ordinary citizens who listen to the legal arguments. The laws are read to them. It's incredibly regular. So if you look and institutionalized. So if you look at Aristotle's Constitution of Athens, it's not a very long document, and the last 8 pages are basically devoted to like the procedure of how to impanel the jurors and how to make sure that the cases run on time. So they put a lot of thought into getting it right, into understanding how ordinary citizens could plausibly have control of this highly technical.
So if they can impanel the jurors, we can count our votes. That's what you're saying.
We hope so.
Presumably, it should be a little more straightforward. All right, I want to take us out on a question from Bella Hoba. She asked, how can we in our modern democracies prevent the rise of a modern Alcibiades to power? And could you discuss the practice of ostracism in Athens? I don't know if you can answer both of those because we only have a few minutes, but I think that is the question of the day. Either of you or any of you want to take a crack at it? Or what did the Athenians think you could do or should do?
Well, they had harsher punishments for bad behavior in office than we do, right? And that was a deterrent, right? You could ostracize such people. You could execute such people. We don't really have that at our disposal. As Matt said, all those very things are in the hands of ordinary people. To impeach a president is like, it's like brain surgery.
I mean, if you think that like the generals are the highest elected officials in Athens are elected, you elect 10 of them, not one. You elect them for 1 year at a time. And, probably, I don't know the figures, but it wouldn't surprise me if something like 15 or 20% of them ended up impeached over over the course of the city's history. So basically, right, like there was just much more assertive control. And you can't necessarily stop the rise of an Alcibiades or a Trump, but you can cut it off as soon as you realize that it's the wrong move.
Well, what's also interesting about Alcibiades is that you can cut him off, but then he can go conspire with the enemy, right, with foreigners, and kind of come back in and try to take over democracy in other ways, or he becomes a scapegoat. I mean, it's not clear, right? Like, how much was Alcibiades responsible for what happened to the Athenians? Right? How much were they really just deflecting onto this notoriously charismatic, beautiful, right, persuasive person? So yeah, I mean, there's a conspiracy is there at the end of the day, even with ostracism.
Well, was
exile, I guess.
ostracism an effective tool? Because it seems to me that it could lead very easily to faction and civil war. And in fact, that ostracism is like a special practice that is a form of expelling moral turpitude that, could, depending on the alignment of interest groups, could actually make it difficult to maintain unity of purpose.
Ostracism ends up not being used after, sometime in the 5th century. And the last ostracism we know about actually involved a kind of strategic manipulation of the vote. And it seems, historians are speculating here, but it seems plausible that people, for just that reason, the reasons you're pointing to, Jim, thought ostracism isn't a regularized enough process. And we need something that's more institutionalized and that's leaves less room for some of the ways in which ostracism could be manipulated. So you get a different set of accountability institutions in the 4th century that worked on the whole pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, when Clinton was impeached, his popularity went up. So anyway, but this gets again to the idea of like where we place norms in power when we think about democracy and what work they do. All right, well, we've gotten to 8:02 and we've covered a lot of really interesting ground. I still don't know what the heck is going to happen on Tuesday, but I have a much better sense of what I ought to read, or the kinds of things I ought to read to think about it. And for that, I'm indebted to you all and to the audience for asking such excellent questions. Thank you very much. I'm going to let you all have your weekend back now. And just feel grateful that we can have this kind of a conversation at the University of Chicago.
Thanks so much, Jim and Dee and
you.
Todd and everyone in the audience.
Thanks for coming. Yeah. Bye.
Members of the panel, if you would like to stay for a moment after feedback, I'm going to remove the MVTs, then we can have a little feedback reunion.
Okay.
Have you done that, Ruben?
No, we're doing it as we